Hey, it's Clex. So this time I have a mechanics video, or maybe it's more of a campaign walkthrough video. I don't know, but this time we're going to talk about how to sustain resists while you're playing the game. And a lot of characters have a hard time sustaining resists in Titan Quest. Of all the aRPGs I've played, it's definitely the hardest to cap your resists and to keep your resists capped. And I get a lot of questions about how to do this. I have a defenses guide, an advanced defenses guide that kind of touches on this topic, but we're definitely going to go into more detail about the process of how you do it. So, first, why is this so important? It's kind of my philosophy, and this was, given to me from other aRPGs experiences and modern aRPGs where it's definitely necessary to cap resists. But I also feel that way about Titan Quest. Even though it's difficult, I do think it's necessary to cap your resists if you want to stay alive. Now, fair play, there's plenty of people who like to just build glass cannons. They like to kill as quickly as possible, and they're going to take the deaths on the chin. This is a game of sacrifices. You can't be a glass cannon and have max resists. You have to, there's no way to combine offense and defense in so many ways like other aRPGs provide. So my philosophy is you go defense first and you start introducing offensive items after you're comfortable so you can buy your way into those offensive items. You overcap your resists, then you give up on some of those resist items to buy your way into using things like Aider or Allfather's Rings if you're a pet build, or something with flat damage instead of resist, something like that, right? And this game is very tempting. It's very tempting to use really cool items that you find, blue items, but those are very inflexible. They oftentimes don't include resists. And so the game doesn't really teach a new player especially, but even a veteran, that it is important to cap your resists. And as just a small precursor, I'm not saying that your resists are going to be 80 across the board throughout the whole game. Certainly things like bleed res especially will be pretty low, and some elemental res might be pretty low, but you'll have swap gear, you'll have everything you need to max out resists on a whim. The rest of it's going to come through campaign knowledge, just knowing where things come. I'll provide a few tips at the bottom, but the bulk of this video is about how to maintain capped resists or very, very high resists while playing the campaign. And the assumptions here are that you don't have any inheritance, you're not bringing items from one character to another. There are very, very many endgame, really overpowered resist items, like Crest of Hypnos, Tunic of the Magi, stuff like that. Very, very good. You don't have any of those. That's the assumption. You don't have any resists in your mastery. This is another assumption. So you're not using Herbal Remedy in hunting, and you're not using, what are the others? The Fire thing in Earth Mastery, and Rune of Life, I think it's called, in Rune Mastery. And the last assumption is that you are not lucky. You don't get lucky drops. I will put a small caveat here in that Legendary is a little bit about luck in terms of capping your resists. I tend to always get what I need. I don't know, somehow it always works out for me, but then again I found like 3 or 4 Tunics of the Magi while I'm playing on stream. But I'll let you know a way to make sure your resists are finally honed in for Legendary as well, so don't worry about that. So again, this video is going to be procedural. I'm going to show you how to do it, not just tell you in theory how to do it. I'm going to tell you how I plan my resists and what you need to do in game. So this is going to be a 4-step process. Let's make it video friendly. We love lists, right? So the first is that you want to keep your monster infrequence in mind. Don't worry, we're going to go into all this stuff. Number 2 is that you want to take advantage of your lucky drops. You want to make as good use of them as possible because they're pretty rare, the usable ones at least. 3, you want to supplement at the vendor for anything you're missing. And 4, you want to fix everything with charms and relics. So let's go through these one by one. Alright, so first on the list is to keep your monster infrequence in mind. For this, you're going to use the database, so shout out to the author. It's the THQ database, and you're going to want to get familiar with this tool. Now, what I'm not saying is that you need to memorize every single monster infrequent in here. There's a ton of them. What you're trying to do here is, the idea is you're trying to fill in a gap on your character. You're really short on one particular resistance, and you need to know where to find it so that way you could swap to it or you're trying to pre-plan to find some really nice high magnitude resist pieces. So we're going to look at chess pieces for this example. And I'll use the database right at the start of planning my character to see what items I should keep an eye out for, and also to fix particular issues, like I said, if I'm really lacking. I will say that if you are an intellect-based character, you're probably going to rely a lot more on the other 3 steps of this 4-step process rather than this one. Strength-based characters get a lot of mileage by farming for monster infrequents. There's a ton of high resist monster infrequents that require strength, not very many that require int, and the ones that exist are pretty rare. Dexterity is in a league of its own. If you're playing a full dexterity scaling character, I'm assuming that you're already very familiar with the game because that's much more advanced. I would caution you against that if you're new because there's not very many dexterity only items in the game. So that very much limits your options. So first, you're either strength or your intellect. I'm going to assume that you're strength. If you're not, you can adapt this to whatever you're playing. Just know that if you're intellect, you're going to rely more on the other 3 steps. So really, again, we're not going to memorize everything. The very first thing you want to do is sort by monster infrequents. You could do that here by unchecking the epic and legendary boxes. So now it's just monster infrequents that we have. And again, the idea here, how you cap your resists, is to get high magnitudes of resists, ideally spread around. So you could see this is 85% pierce resistance. Ideally, this would be like 85 pierce or 45 pierce and 40 poison or something like that. Something a little bit more spread around. It really depends on what you're looking for. But keep an eye on anything with really high res. So this is a good example. The process here is to sort for the monster infrequents, to look, keep an eye on the strength requirements or intellect, make sure it's applicable to your character, and just look at them. You can click here to see where they drop the loot tables. So in this case, it's the Gigantes, the heroes, the dactyls. This usually only shows the yellow mobs and the heroes and the bosses who can drop them, not necessarily the white mobs. It's a little bit inconsistent. And don't pay too much attention to this % drop chance. It's good to get a relative sense based on the drop chances of other items, but there's more that goes into this equation, like how many of these creatures, these Charis heroes, appear in a game compared to how many Gigantes you can get to appear in a game. So find an item like this breastplate and then try to farm it on your own. Eventually you're going to get a feel for the ones that are easy to farm. So I'm going to show a couple of the ones that I know for strength that are easy to farm. Ismin's Helm. This checks the boxes, right? It's a strength piece. It has very high poison res. Poison res is something that you often need to increase in a pinch. Maybe you don't have enough gear slots available to put pristine plumage in your gear. You really need that poison res. Great item to keep in mind. It's not always to fix a problem you currently have. Sometimes you're looking for these monster infrequents to pre-plan your character. You know, by looking at the database now that they drop off Lamias, they exist in Act 4. Okay, interesting. So as you're playing your character, when you get to the Lamia areas, you kind of look at your poison res and you say, should I farm an Ismin's Helm? Just in case I need one later for Tower of Judgment, for those Hanar dudes or whatever. Maybe I need one for Cerberus. You know, you have Glade Bracers, but if you equip your Glade Bracers to help against Cerberus, you lose a lot of poison res, so maybe you need an Ismin's Helm to fix that problem. This is what I mean by using the database to keep monster infrequents in your mind. Other items that can drop are, for instance, the Forge gear. This is all Ragnarok stuff. Anything tagged with an R means it's for the Ragnarok DLC. All of the Ragnarok items seem to be pretty common, at least the vast majority of them. And this thing gives 25% elemental resist. So again, this is high magnitude. Elemental gets counted 3 times because it counts in full magnitude for fire, cold, and lightning. And keeping in mind the rarity of this thing, it's very common, and the fact that it can still roll a prefix and a suffix, this is an excellent item to farm if you're a strength character. In fact, there's a whole set of this. There's a Master Forge gloves, I think boots, maybe a helmet. They all do similar things. So you're in paradise if you're a strength character. Little shout out to intellect characters. You might want to farm this Master Seer robe. I have done this one myself. It drops mostly off Tyrannical Mage, who is one of the little two dudes who jumps off the big monster boss when you kill him. But in general, you get the idea. You're coming here to look for a high magnitude of resists on a single monster infrequent, and you kind of want to know where they drop-ish, right? It's not about memorizing every piece. It's more about being able to use this website to not only fill in gaps for problems that you're having right now, but also to pre-plan per character in future playthroughs. You're trying to pick up gear to adapt to the game to make sure you can meet future challenges. But again, this is Titan Quest. This is not Path of Exile where you can easily do that. Gear to gear, your resists are they're going to be fine no matter what. You can be sure of that. In this game, you're often below cap, and you're trying your best to make sure you're capped at the right times. So a good analogy if you're coming from PoE is the very beginning of the game. Think like 3 years ago. You used to carry cold res. You wanted to get your cold res before the Act 1 boss. It's like that. You're trying to make sure you're shored up on certain resists. So it's not always about, oh crap, here's some cold damage, I need cold res. Sometimes it's about, I know cold res is coming. It's time to maybe farm this item while I'm here, while I'm next to these Deviger guys. So I hope this process makes sense. It's mostly about using the database. It's mostly about becoming aware of that these items exist and how to get them. It's up to you whether they're worth to be farmed or whether you're going to include them in your builds. This is just one step in the process. This is not the thing you use to cap all your resists. It's just one step. So with that in mind, we're going to move to step 2, which is to keep in mind your lucky drops and to make use of them. So there's a lot of tempting drops in Titan Quest that are amazing offensively. Let's just say they give a lot of flat damage. There's one good example of that, actually. I think it's a legendary necklace. I've always wanted to use this thing. It's so tempting to me. But unfortunately, it's just a little bit too glass cannon-y. Let's see if I can find it. I know what it looks like because I have it. Here it is. Pendant of Immortal Rage. This thing does have Pierce Res, but Pierce Res is pretty easy to get in other means. So it's not the most impressive thing. And keep in mind that blue and purple items, you cannot put a relic or a charm in them. That is absolutely critical. So remember what I said at the beginning. You're using resists to buy your way into more special items. This is what constitutes, in my mind, as a luxury that you want to buy your way into. You don't need 33 to 41 added physical damage in Titan Quest to beat the game. I would argue that you need resists if your goal is to not die, but different people have different goals. Again, this video is for people who want to maintain high resists. But the problem with this item is it just doesn't give enough defensive value. That should be obvious. So let's talk about the items that do, and what you should do when you find one. First up, pretty common necklace, Obulus. Obulus, Abolus, who knows? Not only does it give the really nice and useful affix of less damage from undead, but it gives a total of, let's just say, 140 resists at level 29. That's pretty good. Plus health, DA, armor. This armor is global since it's a necklace. Pretty good item, right? That should be self-explanatory. If you find this thing, you have to keep a few things in mind. One, you can't enchant it. We'll find out later when we talk about charms and relics. That's going to impact your vitality resist. All right, so you want to be thinking in terms of loss, not only gain. You're going to gain more than you're losing. By level 29, you're not going to have a very good Demon's Blood to put in your necklaces. But in order to use this item, and I don't think you need to buy your way into this item buys itself with its extremely high magnitudes. You just have to consider that you're going to be losing a source of possible vitality res. So if you already had an amazing blue ring, or an amazing purple ring, and only one other ring that you could put a Demon's Blood on, and you have no other sources of vitality res, you might have to give up that other ring in order to use Obulus, just so you can have dual Demon's Blood, or have some other piece that has Vit res. Frankly, my assumption was at the beginning that you're not going to have any inheritance, so that means if you get an Obulus around this level, you're going to use it and you're going to be ecstatic about it. It's not going to require any opportunity cost, any thinking whatsoever. But if you've had it for a while and you're considering keeping it, maybe you're at Hades Act 4 now and you're scratching your head about vitality res, sometimes keeping this thing means sacrificing something else. So just keep that in mind. There's a lack of flexibility in general with these awesome drops, but just because of that, because you can't put relics or charms in them, doesn't mean you don't use them. This is still an extremely high magnitude. Again, resists are a game of magnitudes. And the loot, of course, it drops off Hades. Why wouldn't it? It seems pretty rare, right? But I've found this thing many, many, many times. It's not unheard of that you would get it too. So don't worry about these percentage chances too much. And the second one I want to talk about is Chromatic Diadem. I guess I should have added that I don't recommend you farm these. Not in any way do I recommend you farm items unless they are monster infrequent, they're common enough to get, or they're extremely overpowered like Boar Hunter's Shield. I don't personally farm items on non-inheritance playthroughs. Just get what you get. Well, if you follow this guide, you shouldn't have to farm much of anything at all, maybe the vendor. That's about it. So I don't recommend you farm these items either. It's just if they do drop, how do you react to it? Chromatic Diadem, also one that's extremely, extremely good. It's a little bit more rare, but look at this thing. Level 19, you can find it in late Act 1, early Act 2. I have before a couple times. Has a total of 100 resists. That early in the game, that's incredible. It's beyond good. It's really, really amazing. And there's a very big imbalance between a lot of items that you find in this game, by the way. Compare this with its neighbor, Call of the Wild. How do you even justify equipping this? I guess if you are a Nature Mastery, but would you be doing elemental damage? Maybe a Sharder, an Ice Shard character. But it's kind of hard to justify it, right? There might be so many better options, and how do you live with the lack of resists on this thing? It's kind of difficult to justify, whereas Chromatic Diadem, easy. My argument is that offense is pretty secure in Titan Quest. You don't need too much to scale your damage. There isn't a lot to scale your damage. So just having a base concern over, I don't know, looking for synergies in your masteries and maybe reducing resistance, that's enough. Otherwise, you're just looking for resists, defenses, that sort of thing on your gear. So Chromatic Diadem, obviously exceptional. What are you missing here? In the future, you can't put something like a really well-rolled Shard of Erebus on it. You're missing one of your armor slots, so you might lose some poison res. This thing does give poison res, so it kind of makes up for that. Really, I'd say of all of the ones I'm about to show you, Chromatic Diadem, much easier to equip than Obelisk. But the ultimate example, I think, is coming up, which is this thing, the Tunic of the Magi. So I wanted to include this piece because it's level 46, so you'll probably find it, if you are going to find it, before the end of your playthrough. And I found this thing on 3 separate characters. I don't think I inherited it. I didn't inherit it on any one of them, I don't think. So this was just found while playing through the game. Before I beat the game, I was able to use it for a very long time. My Dragon Hunter, my Pet Summoner, and one other character had this item. So it's not too uncommon. I find it just in random chests and things, it seems like. But anyway, in Legendary, you're going to want to cash in all your luck chips in Legendary to find an item like this. This makes your concerns so much easier. Not only does it have an extremely high magnitude of resist, let's count them up. 120 plus 80, that's 280. So not even counting the life and energy resists, it's 280 total res. And they're all nicely spread out at this very clean 40%. Oh, beautiful item. Really, really overpowered. But this is the exact thing you're looking for. It's going to help you so much. It is intellect. So like I said, a lot of overpowered intellect items. But importantly, this is a video about making sure you can maintain resists on curve. If you find an item like this, then it allows you to buy your way into offense. That's the way you want to look at it. There's really no overcapping shenanigans with resists in this game. There's a couple bosses that do reduce them. But keep these items in mind. Definitely work them into your build. For something like this, It's not hard at all. I just wanted to include this item just because it's the ultimate expression of good luck in farming. You don't need it, and I've definitely gone by without it, but those intellect characters really rely on steps 2 and 3 and 4 in this process. This is step 2, finding lucky drops. So I really wanted to include Tunic of the Magi for an intellect character, just because if you find this thing, it's good game, right? You've solved the puzzle. All right, so the next topic on the list, number 3, is going to be to supplement at the vendor. This is probably one of the most critical steps for a non-inheritance playthrough, and if you watch my stream, it's one of the most common things you see me doing, particularly for rings and amulets. So I'm not going to say that you have to go to every vendor and look for every piece of gear and hover over it and say, 39 poison res, can I make that work? Or anything like that. If you look through your own gear and you see that something is underperforming, like for instance, I don't have a weapon and shield, there we go, then maybe you can deliberately keep a better eye out for that at the vendor, especially if it's something that you know you could get a decent resist in. I'll go over that a little bit later when I talk about swap items. But in general, you're looking for rings and amulets, so let's go over the exercise for that. Obviously, it's just scrolling through the rings and amulets, right? You'll get an eye for how to pick this up and to do it quickly. So I know there's nothing of value for me in here. What am I looking for? I want resist on the prefix, so this thing is resistant jewel, and I want health on the suffix. So for instance, this is Jewel of Immortality. Ideally, I would get both, so I would get a resistant Jewel of Immortality, and that's exactly what I have. This one's a resistant Seal of Expertise, Adroitness. These are all Allfathers and stuff like that. Here's one, a resistant Band of Immortality. You're looking for stuff like that. All right, so you're going to find really good upgrades as you play the game. Constantly, the prefix is going to upgrade, so you might start with finding rings that give 15% in one resist, and then 20, and then 30, and then 40. I don't know them exactly, but eventually you'll get to this point where they can go up to 60. So I'm going to let you know what you're looking for per item. So with rings, it's particular elemental resist, so either cold or fire or lightning. Sometimes you could get the ones that give you both and make them work in your build. I recommend just getting the single res. For amulets, you're looking for annulling or prismatic or something like that. Something that gives you elemental resist, all elemental resist. So literally elemental resist, not cold, not fire, not lightning, but elemental resists. You're not looking for poison or pierce or anything like that. For chest pieces, I tend to go for pierce or poison. You tend to find those pretty frequently. For all armor slots, you can find things that give like fire, for instance. I would stay away from those. It's not enough to equip an item like that. Maybe if you're desperate, if you're about to fight a boss and you just need a little bit more resists. It's much better to get something like Pierce Poison, because usually with your elemental resists, you get a lot of elemental baseline items. You know, stuff that gives you LE res. Or you fill it in with your rings or whatever. But in general, I'm going to say with armor, you're going to want Pierce or Poison armor if you're looking at the vendor for something. Unfortunately, you can't find bleed armor on the vendor, bleed resistant. I don't know if that's a bug. According to the database, some of these affixes, like the impenetrable affix for instance, should be able to provide bleed or pierce, but all of them have pierce in game. There is no chance of you getting bleed on the impenetrable suffix or prefix. So that's unfortunate. That makes it, we'll talk about swap gear in a minute, but there's a definite need to keep bleed gear around as swap gear. And for shields, if you can work a shield into your build, and I really recommend if you're any sort of caster, pretty much, unless you really want to use a specific staff, or you're using Turnian attack or something like that, I really recommend you use a shield. Shields can give you such great value. Look at my shield. This is my bread and butter. I am not a strength-based character. This was a strength-intellect hybrid, and I got a pretty decent shield that only required level 41, only 326 strength, the way I have it scaled, and it gives me a very high pierce res roll. We'll look at the charm on it. Legendary Rigid Carapace, that's another 81% pierce res. This thing's giving me near 130 pierce res out of the 180 that I need. So just keep in mind that shields can be an amazing source of pierce res. You could also get poison. Again, I would shy away from any one of the elements. The yellow prefixes, they don't give you all elemental resists, they give you one particular one. I don't recommend you go that route. You can if it really fits in nicely. In general, we'll go through this one more time. Rings is particular resists. This character is a bad example for that because she was a pet character. So the pet stuff took the prefix, unfortunately. So I can show you down here. Rings is going to be particular elemental resists. Amulets are going to be all elemental resists, such as this amulet, 23% elemental. All your armor slots and your shield are going to be either pierce or poison. That's what you should keep an eye out for. And if you can, try to get resists on your weapon. Unless you're attack based, then your weapon is just a stat stick. So I often look for weapons like this. This thing is amazing, by the way. This thing has 140 resists on a weapon. I don't even care about any of that other stuff. What is offensive ability? I don't know. I don't even read that. 140 elemental resists? That's pretty good for a weapon. But anyway, I told you before we even started looking at the vendor that you're not here to fill in every single piece. Don't shop for every single piece. I'm not even saying that your helm, your arms, your legs, and your whatever, they should all be pierce and poison. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying if you are going to shop for those pieces, I would say it's the smartest thing to get those particular resists in those particular slots. I found it makes you the most flexible. Really, you're going to be looking for monster infrequents, lucky drops. You might have some monster infrequents in mind. Every build uses Stonebinder's Cuffs pretty much. So you'll find what you find, and you supplement at the vendor with what you're missing. And usually it's with those particular resists that I told you. And that's a good segue into talking about swap gear. So like I said, in this game, very hard to cap your resists. So you're going to have to rely on campaign knowledge to know what's coming, and swap gear in order to prepare for it. So for instance, you could see I went swap happy on this character. Before I found my current shield, I was carrying around this exotic carapace. Don't really need that anymore. It's just kind of a habit that I carry them around. And rings, they only take up one square. So what I recommend is that you get a swap ring for each element. Actually, 2 swap rings for each element. So that's 6 rings in your inventory. 2 of the fire, 2 of the cold, 2 of the lightning. The suffix doesn't matter. It can either be defensive ability or health, one or the other. But make sure you have 2 in case you need to double swap for extreme measures to really max out your cold or something like that. But you can see I carried around this weapon. Why? It gave vitality resist. That's the only reason. Did I ever use it? I think I used it once. It did its job. It filled its role. I've kept it ever since, even though this character is pretty much done. And it's fine. I kept this nullifying amulet. Now my current amulet is a pet piece. So again, I bought my way into this pet gear. That was one of the topics I said at the beginning. And because of that, I lost resists. But that doesn't mean I don't have access to resists, right? I still have resist items in my inventory just in case there's something too difficult. I can't live with this, undercapped elemental res. I could swap. I'd lose a lot of pet damage, but I would be a lot safer for it. So that's why swap gear is so important. I have this amulet because it's very flexible. I like to keep ritual necklaces for when I'm fighting demons and magical creatures. This is just to equip gear. Prismatic, this is the other thing I was talking about. Prismatic and annulling, or nullifying, whatever. Those are going to be your bread and butter for elemental resist necklaces. I highly recommend you get an elemental resist necklace. They're very flexible. They're very impactful. This doesn't seem great when you compare it to Amulet of Hygeia or Hygeia. But keep in mind that you cannot enchant Amulet of Hygeia. And what is Amulet of Hygeia missing? It's missing a lot of vit res. It doesn't have any vit res. So what if I needed vit res? I couldn't use this. This thing is just flat out better because I get some elemental res and I could put a demon's blood in it. So keep in mind the flexibility of green and yellow items is so incredibly important. That's why if you've watched my build guides, most of my endgame gear is honestly enchantable stuff. It's only the really overpowered blue and purple items that I think are worth equipping. They have to be exceptional to overcome the loss of not being able to use a charm or a relic. So anyway, you've got your rings and your amulets for swaps for elemental damage. You've kept other things to swap, for particular measures like against demons and magical creatures. You might have a glade piece for Cerberus. I think mine are inside my stash. Let's take a look. Usually I keep them here because I only use it for Cerberus. Looks like I don't have any glade gear saved up. I must have sold it after I killed him. But anyway, for bleed, bleed was the other thing I said is very difficult to get. You might want to save every single piece of gear that gives you bleed res on it. That sounds extreme, but I'm not kidding. That stuff is very difficult to find when you need it. There's only one very reliable charm that gives bleed res, and that's a well-rolled boar hide. This thing, the standard boar hide for normal is 10% bleed. That's not enough. So you need a well-rolled boar hide. You need it on your armor slots if available. Every unique you find that gives you bleed res, just keep it. Do yourself a favor. Keep it somewhere in your storage. You might need it later. Bleed res is by far the least important resist in the game. It's only used for about 5 fights. Let's see if I can recall them all. Boar Snatcher in Epic and Legendary Act 1. Yao Guai, he's the demon boar boss in Act 3. Only on Epic and Legendary. His normal mode version's not a lot of bleed res. Trolls in Act 5. The wargs and birds in Act 5. And I know I'm missing one. Oh well, there's one more. But I don't even know what they are, right? But I know they're coming, and I know it's important to have bleed res when you get there. I guess Golden Boar. Golden Boar has a lot of bleed res as well. So you're going to want to keep all of those items. You're only going to use them at those points in the game. But again, they're very, very rare. And when you need them in a pinch, you are not going to find them. You're not going to find them at the vendor. Monster infrequents are a good bet, but pretty much only if you're a strength character. And only until you reach Act 5. So it's because you can get the Harness of the Valhalla. It's a little bit dicey with bleed res. I recommend you just keep everything. Whether or not you use it is inconsequential. You can see I kept this shield. It has 43%. I kept this chest piece just in case I wanted to put a boar hide on it. And I kept this helmet. 34% bleed res. And is that the only ones I found on this playthrough? No, I have this thing, Paloxis, and it's got a legendary boar hide. You can see the legendary well-rolled boar hide, 65% bleed res, pretty good. So this is all a good segue into step 4 of the process. Just to recap, we've talked about keeping a monster infrequents in mind, so maybe by this point you've got a few of them equipped even, or you're comfortable in the fact that you could easily go back and farm one if you needed it. We've learned how to react to our lucky drops if we do get lucky drops. Sometimes you will. I tend to get at least 1 or 2 in every single playthrough. Even if you're unlucky, though, you shouldn't need that step. And then the third step, of course, was to supplement all of your bad luck at the vendor. I use the vendor for most of my resist needs, to be honest. I don't rely on anything more than I rely on steps 3 and 4. So let's talk about step 4 then. It's relics and charms. You can see I'm into my relics and charms. This is not a show-off thing. This is just the ones I managed to accumulate on this particular playthrough. I keep every single relic that I find, even components nowadays. This character did not. But I keep components, fractions, don't care. If it's a relic, I'll keep it. They're very difficult to farm. Charms I find are very easy to farm. I keep the really important ones like Demon's Blood and Pristine Plumage. You can see those are kind of missing here. That's because I use them. And there's only a few things I want to talk about with charms. One is the particularly good ones and where to find them. And 2 is the importance of completion bonuses. So the really good ones, I'll go ahead and try to set some of them aside and we can talk about them one by one. And these, again, this is a video about resists, so we're talking about resists. There's a lot of really good charms and relics, but I really recommend that you prioritize the resists and consider all the other ones as kind of a luxury. You may or may not even be able to equip them. Here we go. All right, so this is all the ones I would consider to be very, very good in every playthrough, so let's step through them. Rigid carapace, and of course, you can look up all of these on the database as well. Rigid carapace, amazing for shields. You can see the one I have on my shield, 81%. Very, very, very critical for my legendary survival. Pierce res is very important in a lot of places in the game. Keep rigid carapace in mind. You grind it from the beetles in Act 2 at Giza. Demon's Blood, arguably the most important, I would say, of all of the resist charms and relics. This is very hard to find. There's multiple grinding spots. One is the tombs in Act 2. You can go through those. You can find out which tombs are the best in terms of yield. I don't recommend that. The Yuris have a horrible drop rate. I would recommend the Ice Pixies in Act 3. You know that part where there's an old guy in the snow and he's running towards a cave, and you just kill all the monsters around him and you turn in the quest there. That's the spot I recommend farming. There's nothing but pixies and Jinn around there, and there's a fountain nearby. The best place to get it is definitely Tower of Judgment, I would say, and the first domain against those Lemos. So the problem is you tend to need Vitality Res very early on. If your character is super powerful, you could farm Shadow Maul in Act 1. He's in the swamp before the blacksmith, the hidden blacksmith. And so you could see if he's home and farm him. Anyway, regardless, you could look on the database for where it drops, but you could see by the completion bonus you can get 85% Vit Res. Vit Res tends to come in high quantities or not at all in gear. There are exceptions, of course, but suffice to say that it's very hard to cap your Vit, and it's one of the most important resists in the entire game. Vit appears when you'd least expect it. It's not just the purpley pink damage, it's also percent health damage. A lot of abilities you wouldn't think have percent health damage, especially in bosses, do have percent health damage. So you can only put it in rings and amulets, which automatically makes it very hard to do anything else with your rings and amulets. You definitely feel the loss of equipping like an obelisk like we talked about earlier. You definitely feel the loss in your vitality resist if you do that. So learn to grind Demon's Blood, find a favorite spot, one of the most important items in the game. Another important one then is this pristine plumage. Now, you probably know if you watch me play that I like to farm this just before the Megara coast. I think most people like to farm it at Knossos. If you just go right out of town and go in immediate south, there's a lot of harpies near there. This is a great early game item. Again, this is the legendary version. It rolled extra poison res. Extremely easy to farm this in the early game. I mean, really easy. It's conceivably like a shame on you almost if you don't cap your poison res in the very, very early game. Because all you need is 4 pristine plumage on all 4 of your armor slots. Yeah, that takes up your armor slots, but I mean, what do you need that early in the game, right? We're talking about Act 1 normal. So grind a lot of these, keep them all. If one of them has a bad completion bonus, keep it. Don't sell it. You might need it to enchant some Cerberus gear or something like that later on. Just trust me on that. You're going to go through a lot of pristine plumage. It's one of the better ones. Again, I talked about the difficulty of bleed res. When you're trying to get your bleed res, it's very difficult. So, Boar's Hide, guess where this drops? Yeah, it drops off boars. You have to kill them. I recommend Ambrosos, the village next to the Friendly Centaur in Act 1. You could also farm it in Athens in Act 5 if you really wanted to. But what makes this good is, of course, the scarcity of bleed. And often you're going to find some piece like this Ruggan Gorgon Sash of the Wilds. 25% bleed res. What you could do is just plop this thing on there. I can't do that from this interface. But that turns a 25 resist item into a 55 resist item. Of course, your Boar's Hide can roll extra poison, or extra bleed, like this one. And notice that with these charm bonuses, that's why I wanted to bring this up. Oftentimes, the completion bonus is better than the base resist bonus. which is kind of mind-boggling to be honest. Consider this is the ultimate example. All a rigid carapace does is give you pierce res, but the completion bonus gives you more than even the base item, which is just crazy. So farming for these really nice completion bonuses, very important, particularly with the bleed res and the pierce res. Next one then, this is the most RNG based one. It's the best one, and it's also the rarest one, unfortunately. It's of course the Crystal of Erebus. So the base property is not that great. It's just some vitality res, kind of a low amount, takes up a helm slot. I don't know, especially if you're an intellect character on legendary. That's kind of hard to do. I guess you're going to have Sitheno's Wisdom, but if you have a Crest of Hypnos, ain't going to happen. Anyway, I'm going on a tangent. This thing, what makes it really good is that the completion bonus, that one that gives you the resists, is completely broken absurd. You could go on the database to look at it yourself. It's something like almost 100 res on its own on normal mode. On Epic, it's like 150. On Legendary, it's close to 200. I don't know. It's been a while since I looked at it because it's so rare, which brings me to the next point on this particular item. You have to get lucky. You can only get one of these per difficulty per playthrough. You cannot rely on it. So treat this one like step 2. It's a lucky drop. Now, what's nice about this is if you do get the right completion bonus, obviously I did not, those resists are spread around so nicely. Do I have another one somewhere? I don't think I do. Yeah, I do not. One of my other characters rolled actually a legendary Crystal of Erebus. It has all the resists on it. Oh, it's so nice. So treat it like, a lucky drop. Definitely the concession you'd have to make is that unless you're wearing a Crest of Hypnos, I would definitely replace whatever helm you have with something that's enchantable. So if your helm is part of a set, I would really, really consider maybe breaking the set up just to use this Crystal of Erebus. It's a really good, obviously RNG-oriented item. And then the last stuff, these are all together. Notice 2 are relics and 1 is a charm, so we'll start with the charm. Yeti Fur, probably the easiest charm to grind in the game, or one of the easiest. It drops off, where does this drop? It's difficult to tell, really. I don't know. But it gives cold res, and of course, all 3 of these are different elements. They all drop in Act 3, and if you desperately need to shore up on a particular resist, and this will happen, by the way, if you're not relying on elemental resist as a baseline, if you just have this amalgamation of fire here, cold here, lightning here, we have some elemental res here, that's fine. If you start playing that game, then you're going to have to supplement with these items in order to max all your resists. That's not a place I want to be in particular because it means you have to rely on these items, thus you can't use things like pristine plumage or whatever else. So because of that, I really recommend that you go for the all elemental baseline for your resists. And only if you're desperate would you use something like this, or only if it fit into the particular vision for your character. Maybe you're using that Ichthian Shell Shield that I mentioned earlier. That thing gives cold res. And maybe you have a lightning ring and a fire ring to make up for that, or maybe not. Maybe one of your rings is just some other thing that you just really want to equip, maybe a Band of Souls or something. And so you can't fit in the fire res. Well, maybe you could use a Domain of the Dragon Kings instead. I will say, and I'll show off the Jade Emperor's Serenity. This is the lightning one. I will say that 2 of the 3 of these are relics. Good luck, my friend, farming for the completion bonus. 2 things. 1, relics are rare. Completion bonus are rare. It's very hard to get the right one. So this one did roll the correct one. But that leads me to the other thing, is that it's not very good, is it? It's 10% extra lightning. Compare that to the rigid carapace where it like doubled it, right? Over doubled it. It's a little bit lackluster. So just keep that in mind for these particular ones. Do I have a better Dragon King? Doesn't look like I do. Yeah. Yeti Fur is generally a pretty good one. So it's the one I use most frequently when I want to supplement my particular elemental resists. So that's it for relics and charms. Really, it's again about sacrificing pretty much everything for the name of defense and resists. more than easy to do in Titan Quest. Damage is fine in this game, no problem. So you're going to be giving up Aether and other things. Maybe you're building a Reflect character. You can't get that Golem's Heart in your Rings and Amulets because you need the Demon's Blood. Those are concessions you make while you level, and then eventually, again, you buy your way in to using a Golem's Heart or, an Aether on your rings instead of a Demon's Blood. And you do that by following this 4-step process and repeating it until you get, hopefully with step 2 in particular, lucky enough to get something like a Crest of Hypnos or a Shard of Erebus or a Tunic of the Magi. So that's my philosophy on it, resists over all. There are some builds where I'm creating, I specifically need a Stew of Enhenmar or whatever this is, or I specifically need, what's another good example? I have a very limited amount of options here. Here we go. I specifically need a Golden Fleece. Maybe it's a Sharder or something like that. There are some builds where you need that one or two things just to make it work. All right, so keep that in mind, of course. I'm just going over the very base character with a very blank assumption of what's going on. These are the tools you're going to use and the steps you're going to take to max your resists. And I wanted to end this video just on some benchmark suggestions and a couple of tips to round things out. So by benchmarks, I mean if you're not an expert on the campaign and you want to know kind of where to find things, then or what to prepare for, I'll just give you a couple of hints. If you really want to know more, I have a whole campaign walkthrough. I know that's pretty long, so you'd have to get to the right part. But if you kind of played the campaign once before and you're like, oh, man, what do you do to prepare for this boss? Then you can go to the right video and then kind of just search through the bar until I get to that point. And I think I always mention for every boss what they do, at least on a high level. But anyway, to give a couple hints, from start to finish in the campaign, first, Act 2, Babylon, that's your first real benchmark for resists. So when we're talking about shoring up on something or maybe swap gear, very often I'll go double cold. That early in the game, it's very unlikely I have anywhere close to capped res. So I'll swap to double cold rings, so always for me, it's a benchmark to have 2 decent cold res rings by the time I get to the beginning of Act 3. Why? Because most of these hints I'm going to give you are because of shotgun damage. Shotgun damage is not balanced in this game. You can shotgun, enemies can shotgun. If you're looking to not die, the enemy shotgun's the most important thing, right? And it's the Tide Callers, those stupid Ichthian Tide Callers in Babylon. They will one-shot your character if you're not careful, if you're close enough to them, if you didn't spot them. So in order to prevent that disaster from happening, you really want as high of cold res as possible. At least 65%. Realistically, you want it capped. The next really bad, dangerous shotgun is... Actually, this kind of went out of order. The first one is Scarab in Act 2. He's the very first boss inside the library. He doesn't seem too difficult, but he, ignoring the slow and all the other annoying things, will shotgun that poison, and it's very, very devastating. On Legendary, even with capped poison res, it's just ridiculous damage. So, almost like the main takeaway of this conversation is that you should just watch out for shotguns, but you want to do what you can with resists as well. Have maxed poison res by the time you reach Scarab in Act 2. Very easy to do. Again, shame on you if you don't have the plumage for that. Every character has easy access to max poison res. Alright, moving on into Act 3 then. We've already passed Babylon, we've had our cold res. Lightning. You might want to consider, until you get really good at fighting Dragonkin, you might want to consider double swapping or at least single swapping to a lightning res ring. Again, we're going over those swap rings. This is why you keep swap gear. Just because those dragon mages, in addition to having a ridiculous reflect mechanic, also have a shotgun attack with their staves. It's not based on the damage of their staves, it's lightning orbs, kind of like the skeleton in Act 1, one of the mini-bosses. You probably by that point don't have enough lightning res, but by Act 3 especially, you'll have a couple of rings. Most definitely you'll have something to protect yourself. So just going through all of the Dragonians, maybe just swap to lightning. It's not that much of the game you have to do it for, so it's not that big of a deal. Typhon, of course, he has a lot of resists, but lightning is among the most important. Vitality is also pretty important. So is fire to a small extent. And also, critically, life leech resistance. We didn't talk about any of the secondary resistances in this game, so a quick shout out to those. They're less important than the primary resists, very dependent on your knowledge of the campaign, and easy to get in certain sources like Toth's Glory or through masteries. I won't talk about them too much, other than one more thing, which is that I absolutely adore Ajax. Do I have an Ajax somewhere? Yes, I do. Embodiment of Ajax. This thing is amazing. You get it in Act 4. Keep an eye out for it. If you can fit it in your build somewhere, it's a great alternative to not having anything like Toth's Glory or the Defense Mastery Iron Will. Anyway, we're talking about resist benchmarks. So that's Typhon. You want Lightning, Fire, Vitality, and Life Leech. Kind of hard to get all of those right, but hey, that's Typhon. Act 4. The spider boss hits really hard in melee, so you want to be able to survive any other damage that happens. Another significant portion, if you're unlucky, is a combination of lightning and vitality. That's those little chain lightning things that the kids, the little tiny albino spiders, do to one another. And if you're caught in that tether, then you take lightning and vitality. Well, here's the problem. If Mama Spider catches you in her web, and you had just killed her babies, or maybe she hadn't spawned them yet, she's going to spawn all of them right on top of you. Sometimes they will surround you and immediately start doing that lightning vitality. That's lethal, my friend. You are toast. You are spider food. So try to do what you can to swap to lightning. It's worth noting that on your swap rings, the cold one in particular, it's very good to have Demon's Blood on it, kind of like this thing. Very commonly in this game, if there's cold damage, there's also vitality, or the other way around. If there's vitality, there's also cold. They come together a lot, particularly in one very common attack. It's the pink laser that you see Bandari do, the Terracotta boss. You'll see that thing everywhere. Very common to have cold and vitality. So put your Demon's Blood on cold, maybe put a Demon's Blood on a lightning res, just so you can deal with the spider in Act 4. Later in Act 4, you're going to fight Typhon. This is another shotgun. It's the undead Typhon. It's Pierce physical. He's also got some vitality, but really it's Pierce throughout Act 4 that you're really concerned about. Grandmaster Mackay archers, undead Typhon, Lamias, all the hard-hitting spear creatures. It's pretty critical that you get as much Pierce res at the beginning of Act 4 as possible. And the last hint that I'll give is in Act 5, Bleed res. Bleed res, they decided to just put more bleed res in the game. Primarily this comes from trolls. Every single troll has a chance to apply bleed damage to you. All of those can stack because any dot from different sources can stack. And if you're surrounded by 20 trolls and they all put a bleed on you, you're probably going to die. So just have an extra consideration towards bleed in Act 5. This is definitely not all the resists you need to know. These are just some major hints. And lastly, I'm going to go over some tips just to round this out. First, you want to keep a high magnitude of resists on all of your gear. So if you're looking for gear, it's not enough just to say, oh, this has got 10% cold res. That's enough. That's cute. No, don't overly tempt yourself or overly, fool yourself into using an otherwise good item if it has low resists. If you want to play the resist game, it's all about magnitude. It's difficult to shuffle things around, to supplement at the vendor, and to fix with charms and relics, all critical parts of the resist game. If your resists just don't have enough magnitude, you're always going to come up short. So it's all about magnitudes. Make sure to count the resists before you get overly enamored. Make sure that you completely dismiss every other affix, right? And also dismiss any resists that you're already capped. So that doesn't mean you sell the item if it doesn't pass this check. Maybe you just put it in your storage area instead. But it's a game of magnitudes. A good example of this is when I've been playing Grim Dawn. There was one point on my first character, my Death Knight, where I was just struggling. I had augments, I had charms and relics, and I had all of my gear. And I was just struggling to get max res. And in Grim Dawn, that's pretty easy to do. It turns out my problem wasn't in that I was doing poorly at solving the puzzle. I was mulling over this between all of the resources in that game to cap my res. The problem is that my gear simply just didn't have a high enough magnitude all around of resistances. So I just went to the vendor and I bought a couple of pieces that had, a lot of resists compared to what I had before. And that fixed the issue. It made it so much easier to solve the puzzle. And that's what the resist game is also, is it's a puzzle. You have to solve it every now and then, particularly at the start of Epic and Legendary. Two, and this is very helpful for the first point, is to have a high elemental baseline. What I mean by that is don't get cold, lightning, and fire separately. If you can help it, get them all together. There's enough items in this game that give elemental res. There's enough monster infrequents that give elemental res. Enough item affixes like prismatic and nullifying on your necklace, we mentioned those before, that give elemental res. You're not going to get everything via elemental, but you can get a good baseline. That makes it much, much easier for your swap rings and stuff to make up for the rest. And for things like Domain of the Dragon King and Yeti Fur to actually have an impact. Otherwise, it's not very exciting to go from like negative 50 to like negative 10, right? That's not very exciting. So you want to have a decent baseline of your elements established already. Particularly for elements, that's important because this all elemental resistance stat occurs. Next, and I'll say this again, is that cold tends to pair very well with vitality. So particularly on your cold res rings, you might want to put your Demon's Blood in there. If you're going over your overall swap setup and you're trying to figure out where to put your Demon's Blood because they're pretty rare, prioritize your cold res ring. Also, something I've mentioned is pay attention to your secondaries. For all of these items that I put here, just in this little spot, you're going to want to look these up. These are the most common. And just look up their completion bonuses. Often you're looking for the completion bonus that matches the base resist, right? But there's even some of these other ones, depending on if they're offensive or defensive in nature, that might give you resists. So it's worth looking. Like, I often use Incarnation of Wineskin that rolls cold res. This is a very common thing that I use. So you'll find some stuff that's not really fits the mold in terms of its base stats, but the completion bonus can really tip the scales into whether you want to equip it or not. And lastly, it's that masteries give res. So the initial assumptions for this video is that you weren't using those, but you treat those like lucky drops, right? In the same way, except they're permanent. You always have them equipped. They're really nice. So of course I'm talking about, and I don't have any of them here. Actually, I do. I have Permanence of Stone. So I've got Permanence of Stone. That makes it easier to achieve that elemental baseline. If you're a hunter, you're pretty much secured in poison for the whole game. And if you are a rune master, then you have vitality and bleed, which is very helpful. Those things, they just make it easier. That seems obvious, but you don't want to... You want to be able to do this process and to secure good resists for even the most vanilla of blank characters. But just note that Titan Quest is a game that's very hard to cap res, so give extra attention to those masteries that provide resists, especially if it's your starter character, if you don't have any items to inherit, and especially if you plan on making a spellcaster. Those are going to give you so much flexibility. So really pay attention to the resists that you get through masteries. The best are hunting, nature, and rune. There is some in earth, but it's not that great. One last thing at the end here, and sorry for the change in sound. I've adjusted my mic settings since I recorded the initial bits on this video. This is just a small channel update. It's only going to be useful to those of you who watch my content periodically. If you're watching in the future, then, who cares, right? That's why I put it at the end of the video. Just so you guys know what's going on, I have a busy month of June, and I'm not quite sure what I'm going to be playing from June forward. I know this year is going to be an aRPG focus, but in May, since it's kind of a weird sort of the way things are lining up, I'm going to play Pillars of Eternity, so don't be alarmed. That's what I'm going to do on stream. It was the original plan to create content on YouTube for Pillars, but I don't want to introduce a group of people who would come to want more. I wouldn't be able to give them more because I don't plan on playing any other cRPGs, just this 1 month. It's going to be a nice break away from aRPGs for me. And then once the beginning of June is over, by mid-June, I'll be able to settle into something again, and we'll pick it up from there. But it's going to be topsy-turvy for a little while. On the YouTube side of things, you can expect more Titan Quest videos. I would say 4 more around there. And then by the end of May, I'll probably do a video that kind of introduces the next game I'll be playing for a while. So that's kind of what's going on. Bear with me. And about Titan Quest, yeah, I'm moving away from the game, but I love the game. And that just means I don't want to burn out of the game. I naturally only play games for a couple months at a time. So I'm not going to strap myself to a game for the sake of whatever. I'm not a very good actor, so my frustrations and all of that will come through. Hope you can understand, hope you can sympathize with that side of things. I want to make sure that when Titan Quest comes out with another patch, or more content if it does, I want to be excited for it. I don't want to think poorly on the game at all. So we will be moving on. It's just the natural thing. So anyway, that's all I have to say. Things will be steadier in June. On YouTube, it's going to be Titan Quest. On Twitch, it's going to be Pillars of Eternity, just so you know what to expect. Anyway, thanks for watching this one. And as always, I'll see you on the next one.